and Snegor, Peace Corps staff, volunteers, and friends of Peace Corps. Today we celebrate another milestone in the history of the Peace Corps and in the history of the relationship between the United States and Moldova. Today we celebrate Peace Corps and the contributions, large and small, of the more than 1,100 volunteers who have worked in Moldova over the past 20 years. Today we recall what was happening at the beginning. We tell the story about how Peace Corps programs got started. We comment on our experiences, the relationships formed, and the ties that will always bind us to Moldova. I remember fondly the 3 years I lived here, the people with whom I collaborated, the cooperative spirit and the hospitable nature of the Moldovan people, and the many things we were able to accomplish together. But today my story is mostly about Peace Corps. 52 years ago, when President Kennedy first established the Peace Corps, few could have predicted the success of this people-to-people program. Certainly no one could have imagined that some 30 years later, Moldova would invite Peace Corps to send volunteers. As the United States and Moldova discussed the challenges that face this newly independent country, Washington assured Moldova that the United States would assist in every way possible. Making use of Peace Corps volunteers would have been among the many possibilities discussed even before the embassy opened its doors. To recall some of the history, we know that Moldova declared its independence from the Soviet Union on August 27, 1991. Even before that, Moldova had embraced its cultural origins and adopted Romanian as its official language. The people of Moldova were listening to strong rhetoric about restoring the relationship that existed between a large part of present-day Moldova and Romania between the two world wars. Some pressed for reunification. Many thought independence was more important. Others feared that steps toward reunification might be taken. On December the 25th, 1991, the United States formally recognized the independence of Moldova. The following March, Moldova was admitted to the United Nations. Sadly, hostilities broke out between Transnistria and the rest of Moldova. People on both sides died. Over the following months, Moldova struggled to contain and to end the hostilities. The United States opened its embassy on March 18, 1992, with temporary staff drawn from Washington and nearby and U.S. embassies nearby. I was in Washington at the time, involved only in some aspect of the training of personnel who would staff our new embassies that made up the former Soviet Union. I was curious about Moldova because I knew some of the staff who had opened the embassy and would return as permanent staff members. I remember thinking how interesting it would be to work in a newly independent country. However, I had already been assigned to my next posting and thus never expected the phone call I got asking me if I would be interested in going to Moldova. I was interested, but my first response had to be no, because of the commitment that I had already made to a different posting. When my caller explained that I would be considered for the position of ambassador, I knew this was an opportunity and a challenge that I absolutely could not pass up. Between the nomination and appointment of an ambassador are many formalities and much paperwork. Before everything was finished, circumstances required that I go to Moldova sooner rather than later. Thus, I arrived in Chisinau on July the 2nd, 1992, to take charge of the embassy, but knowing that I would have to leave soon, as soon as the Senate scheduled my confirmation hearing. I went to work immediately, meeting with as many government officials as possible to learn their views on many different subjects, and in particular to discuss efforts to calm the conflict with Transnistria. The United Nations sent a fact-finding mission, but no one knew if that meant peacekeepers would follow. In addition to peacekeeping assistance, Moldova needed technical assistance with nation building, adapting its legal system, writing a constitution, introducing a new currency, building a culture of democracy, developing political parties, growing the economy, privatizing state-owned enterprises, making private ownership of property possible, and much more. Not waiting for the possibility of UN assistance, Moldova was already engaged in discussions with Russia regarding the involvement of Russia's 14th Army stationed in Moldova, which was implicated in the attacks from Transnistria. On July 21st, Moldova signed a peace agreement with Russia, an agreement which stopped the gunfire and established a peacekeeping arrangement among the three parties to the conflict. Toward the end of July, I met again with President Snegor to let him know that I was going back to Washington for my confirmation hearings. When I asked what was on his mind that I could work on while I was in Washington, he surprised me by asking me to find out when Moldova would get Peace Corps volunteers. I did not know about the earlier written request that Moldova had sent, but as a former Peace Corps volunteer myself, I was delighted to learn that the President already knew about the Peace Corps and would welcome volunteers. We talked briefly about the kinds of expertise volunteers might be able to provide. While I was in Washington, I visited Peace Corps headquarters to convey Moldova's interest in hosting volunteers. I asked if they had a request from Moldova, and when they checked their files, they found a letter from Valeriu Moravski, the first Prime Minister of Moldova. At the time of my visit, however, Moldova had a new Prime Minister. Thus, I offered to get a request from President Snegor. Our meeting concluded with Peace Corps officials promising to get back to me once decisions were made regarding which of the many new countries would be offered Peace Corps programs. They made it clear, however, that the Peace Corps did not have the resources to send volunteers to all the new countries, at least not in the first year. By late September or early October, President Snegor's letter of invitation was at headquarters. Not long thereafter, a Peace Corps official called me to tell me that Moldova had not made the list of countries where programs could be started in 1993. Although very disappointed, I asked my caller to tell me which countries would be among the first. When I heard that Tajikistan was on the list, I commented that I knew Peace Corps was an independent agency, but I didn't think that Peace Corps went to countries without functioning embassies. I suggested that my caller contact the State Department to learn the nature of the problem that had caused the U.S. Embassy to evacuate its personnel from Tajikistan over the weekend. Yeah. News traveled much more slowly in those days. If the evacuation signals a longer-term problem, I said, I'll assume that Moldova will get Tajikistan's volunteers. A few days later, the Peace Corps official called back and said, okay, you win. He told me that Peace Corps officials would visit Moldova at the beginning of the year. Not exactly a convenient time because of the Moldovan Christmas and New Year's holidays, but a time that I would ask Moldova to make available to Peace Corps. True to their hospitable, cooperative nature, Moldova made sure that the appropriate officials were available to discuss with its visitors from Washington the assistance that Peace Corps could offer and the terms of the country agreement. While privately, we at the embassy thought small business development was a